The young man had been out shooting. He was extremely talkative, and, smiling amiably, at once engaged the doctor in conversation, looking, as he did so, fixedly at his mouth. He had an unpleasant, high-pitched voice that now and then rose to a tinny falsetto. Another oddity of his speech was that, while he was plainly Russian, he pronounced one vowel, u, in a most outlandish manner, like the French u. To utter even this garbled u, he had to make a great effort, and he pronounced it louder than any other sound, accompanying it each time with a slight squeal. At moments, apparently by concentrating, he managed to correct this defect, but it always came back. "What is this?" Zhivago wondered. "I'm sure I've read about it, as a doctor I ought to know, but I can't think what it is. It must be some brain trouble that causes defective speech." The squeal struck him as so funny that he could hardly keep a straight face. "Better go to bed," he told himself. He climbed up onto the rack which was used as a berth. The young man offered to blow out the candle lest it keep him awake. The doctor accepted, thanking him, and the compartment was plunged into darkness. "Shall I close the window?" Yurii Andreevich asked. "You are not afraid of thieves?" There was no reply. He repeated his question louder, but there was still no answer. He struck a match to see if his neighbor had gone out during the brief interval. That he had dropped off to sleep in so short a time seemed even more improbable. He was there, however, sitting in his place with his eyes open. He smiled at the doctor, leaning over him from his berth. The match went out. Yurii Andreevich struck another, and while it was alight repeated his question for the third time. "Do as you wish," the young man replied at once. "I've got nothing a thief would want. But perhaps leave it open. It's stuffy." "What an extraordinary character!" thought Zhivago. "An eccentric, evidently. Doesn't talk in the dark. And how distinctly he pronounced everything now, without any slur. It's beyond me." 15. Tired out by the events of the past week, the preparations for the trip, and the early start, the doctor expected to go to sleep. The moment he had stretched comfortably, but he was mistaken. His exhaustion made him sleepless. Only at daybreak did he fall asleep. His thoughts swarmed and whirled in the dark. But they all fell clearly into two distinct groups, as it were, two main threads that kept getting tangled and untangled. One group of thoughts centered around Tonia. Their home, and their former, settled life where everything, down to the smallest detail, had an aura of poetry and was permeated with affection and warmth. The doctor was concerned about this life, he wanted it safe and whole, and in his night express was impatient to get back to it after 2 years of separation. In the same group were his loyalty to the revolution and his admiration for it. This was the revolution in the sense in which it was accepted by the middle classes and in which it had been understood by the students, followers of Bloch, in 1905. These familiar, long-held ideas also included the anticipations and promises of a new order which had appeared on the horizon before the war. Between 1912 and 1914, which had emerged in Russian thinking, in Russian art, in Russian life, and which had a bearing on Russia as a whole and on his own future. It would be good to go back to that climate, once the war was over, to see its renewal and continuation, just as it was good to be going home. New things were also in the other group of his thoughts, but how different, how unlike the first. These new things were not familiar, not led up to by the old, they were unchosen, determined by an ineluctable reality, and as sudden as an earthquake. Among these new things was the war with its bloodshed and its horrors, its homelessness and savagery, its ordeals and the practical wisdom that it taught. So, too, were the lonely little towns to which the war washed you up, and the people you met in them. And among these new things too was the revolution. Not the idealized intellectuals' revolution of 1905. But this new upheaval, today's, born of the war, bloody, ruthless, elemental, the soldiers' revolution led by those professional revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks. And among the new thoughts, too, was Nurse Antipova. Stranded by the war god knows where. About whose past he knew nothing, who never blamed anyone but whose very silence seemed to be a complaint, who was mysteriously reserved and so strong in her reserve. And so was Yurii Andreevna's honest endeavor not to love her. As wholehearted as his striving throughout his life until now to love everyone, not only his family and his friends, but everyone else as well. The train rushed on at full speed. The headwind, coming through the open window, ruffled and blew dust on Yurii Andreevna's hair. At every station, by night as by day, the crowds stormed and the linden trees rustled. Sometimes carts or gigs rattled up to the station out of the darkness, and voices and rumbling wheels mingled with the rustling of trees. At such moments Yurii Andreevna felt he understood what it was that made these night shadows rustle and put their heads together. And what it was they whispered to each other, lazily stirring their leaves heavy with sleep, like faltering, lisping tongues. It was the very thing he was thinking of. Turning restlessly in his berth the tidings of the ever-widening circles of unrest and excitement in Russia. The tidings of the revolution, of its difficult and fateful hour and its probable ultimate greatness. 16. The doctor did not wake up until after 11. Prince, Prince, his neighbor was calling softly to his growling dog. To Yurii Andreevna's astonishment, they still had the compartment to themselves. No other passenger had got in. The names of the stations were familiar to him from childhood. They were out of the province of Kalyuga and well into that of Moscow. He washed and shaved in pre-war comfort and came back to the compartment in time for breakfast, to which his strange companion had invited him. Now he had a better look at him. What struck him most were his extreme garrulousness and restlessness. He liked to talk, and what mattered to him was not communicating and exchanging ideas but the function of speech itself, pronouncing words and uttering sounds. As he spoke he kept jumping up as if he were on springs. He laughed deafeningly for no reason. Briskly rubbing his hands with contentment, and, when all this seemed inadequate to express his delight, he slapped his knees hard, laughing to the point of tears. His conversation had the same peculiarities as the night before. He was curiously inconsistent, now indulging in uninvited confidences, now leaving the most innocent questions unanswered. He poured out incredible and disconnected facts about himself. Perhaps he lied a little. He obviously was out to impress by his extremism and by his rejection of all commonly accepted opinions. It all reminded Zhivago of something long familiar to him. Similar radical views were advanced by the nihilists of the last century. And a little later by some of Dostoevsky's heroes. And still more recently by their direct descendants. The provincial educated classes. Who were often ahead of the capitals because they still were in the habit of going to the root of things, while in the capitals such an approach was regarded as obsolete and unfashionable. The young man told him that he was the nephew of a well-known revolutionary, but that his parents were insurrectable reactionaries, real dodos, as he called them. They had a fairly large estate in a place near the front, where he had been brought up. His parents had been at swords' points with his uncle all their lives, but the uncle did not bear them a grudge. And now used his influence to save them a good deal of unpleasantness. His own views were like his uncle's, the talkative man informed Zhivago. He was an extremist in everything, whether in life, politics, or art. This too reminded the doctor of Pyotr Verkhovensky, not so much the leftism as the frivolity and the shallowness. He'll be telling me he's a futurist next, thought Yurii Andreevna, and indeed they spoke of modern art. Now it'll be sport, race horses, skating rinks, or French wrestling. And the conversation turned to shooting. The young man had been shooting in his native region. He was a crack shot, he boasted, and if it had not been for the physical defect that had kept him out of the army he would have distinguished himself by his marksmanship. Catching Zhivago's questioning glance, he exclaimed. "What? Haven't you noticed anything? I thought you had guessed what was the matter with me." He took 2 cards out of his pocket and handed them to Yurii Andreevna. One was his visiting card. He had a double name. He was called Maxim Aristarchofich Klintsov Pogorevsky or just Pogorevsky, as he asked Zhivago to call him, in honor of his uncle who bore this name. The other card showed a table with squares, each containing a drawing of two hands variously joined and with fingers differently folded. It was an alphabet for deaf mutes. Suddenly everything became clear. Pogorevsky was a phenomenally gifted pupil of the school of either Hartmann or Ostrogradov. A deaf-mute who had reached an incredible facility in speaking and understanding speech by observing the throat muscles of his teachers. Putting together what he had told him of the part of the country he came from and of his shooting expedition, the doctor said, "Forgive me if this is indiscreet. You needn't tell me. Did you have anything to do with setting up the Zhivago Republic? But how did you guess? Do you know Blashyko? Did I have anything to do with it? Of course I did." Pogorevsky burst forth joyfully, laughing, rocking from side to side, and frenziedly slapping his knees. And once again he launched on a long and fantastic discourse. He said that Blashyko had provided the opportunity and Zhivago the place for the application of his own theories. Yurii Andreevich found it hard to follow his exposition of them. Pogorevsky's philosophy was a mixture of the principles of anarchism and Hunter's tall stories. Imperturbable as an oracle, he prophesied disastrous upheavals in the near future. Yurii Andreevich inwardly agreed that this was not unlikely, but the calm, authoritative tone in which this unpleasant boy was making his forecasts angered him. "Just a moment," he said hesitantly. "True, all this may happen. But it seems to me that with all that's going on, the chaos, the disintegration, the pressure from the enemy, this is not the moment to start dangerous experiments. The country must be allowed to recover from one upheaval before plunging into another. We must wait till at least relative peace and order are restored." "That's naive," said Pogorevsky. "What you call disorder is just as normal a state of things as the order you're so keen about. All this destruction, it's a natural and preliminary stage of a broad creative plan. Society has not yet disintegrated sufficiently. It must fall to pieces completely, then a genuinely revolutionary government will put the pieces together and build on completely new foundations." Yurii Andreevich felt disturbed. He went out into the corridor. The train, gathering speed, was approaching Moscow. It ran through birch woods dotted with summer houses. Small roofless suburban stations with crowds of vacationers flew by and were left far behind in the cloud of dust raised by the train, and seemed to turn like a carousel. The engine hooted repeatedly, and the sound filled the surrounding woods and came back in long, hollow echoes from far away. All at once, for the first time in the last few days, Yurii Andreevich understood quite clearly where he was, what was happening to him, and what awaited him in an hour or so. 3 years of changes, moves, uncertainties, upheavals. The war, the revolution. Scenes of destruction, scenes of death, shelling, blown up bridges, fires, ruins, all this turned suddenly into a huge, empty, meaningless space. The first real event since the long interruption was this trip in the fast-moving train. The fact that he was approaching his home, which was intact, which still existed, and in which every stone was dear to him. This was real life, meaningful experience, the actual goal of all quests. This was what art aimed at: homecoming, return to one's family, to oneself, to true existence. The woods had been left behind. The train broke out of the leafy tunnels into the open. A sloping field rose from a hollow to a wide mound. It was striped horizontally with dark green potato beds. Beyond them, at the top of the mound, were cold frames. Opposite the field, beyond the curving tail of the train, a dark purple cloud covered half the sky. Sunbeams were breaking through it, spreading like wheel spokes and reflected by the glass of the frames in a blinding glare. Suddenly, warm, heavy rain, sparkling in the sun, fell out of the cloud. The drops fell hurriedly and their drumming matched the clatter of the speeding train, as though the rain were afraid of being left behind and were trying to catch up. Hardly had the doctor noticed this when the Church of Christ the Saviour showed over the rim of the hill, and a minute later the domes, chimneys, roofs, and houses of the city. Moscow, he said, returning to the compartment. Time to get ready. Pogorevsky jumped up, rummaged in his hunter's bag, and took out a fat duck. Take it, he said. As a souvenir. I have rarely spent a day in such pleasant company. Zhivago's protests were unavailing. In the end he said. All right, I'll take it as a present from you to my wife. Splendid. Splendid, your wife, Pogorevsky kept repeating delightedly, as though he had heard the word for the first time, jerking and laughing so much that Prince jumped out and took part in the rejoicing. The train drew into the station. The compartment was plunged into darkness. The deaf-mute held out the wild duck, wrapped in a torn piece of some printed poster.